We're here with Brandon Garrett of Howard & Howard. He's a franchise attorney. He's going to answer some questions, not just about food trucks interested in getting into the business, but also food trucks that are currently doing really well or thinking about getting into the franchise game. We appreciate you being here today.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. So the first thing would love you to talk about a little bit is that new truck. I always tell new trucks, if you just want to have one truck, your whole business is going to revolve around one truck. Don't do it. It's too hard. And you'll end up working 16 hours a day, and you know, it's a very tough business. But if you're thinking about building a brand, creating a multi-truck business or a brick and mortar, then a food truck is a great way to start. So I think the first thing I'm going to ask you is, that guy that's just about to start a food truck that has bigger aspirations down the road, what's something that he can do to kind of prepare himself for the next phase after he gets his food truck on the road?
That's a great question. The way I like to start that answer with my clients is basically think about building a house, right? The foundation of that house is extremely critical, right? You hope to have that house for many, many, many years to come. If you kind of slack on the foundation elements, chances are you're going to be doing yourself a pretty big disservice down the road. So sit down with your partners, the managers, whomever you're going to be kind of developing this brand around with, and kind of envision, building that house, so to speak. What's the name going to be like? What's the logo going to be like? Trademarking. Those things take a lot of time from kind of the process standpoint of getting it registered. And you want to really, make sure that you're kind of crossing those T's and dotting those I's now, as opposed to waiting down the road. Other things like beginning to start building out the manuals or the protocols, the procedures, hiring practices. How many employees do you need? Are they part-time? Are they full-time? What are the hours of operations that you're going to be working with? Obviously, recipes are a really big thing. Pretty much everything that you do from that decision when you say, hey, I'm going to start a food truck and I really want to grow it into something big, everything that you do, put it down on paper. You'll be able to organize it and clean it down the road, but you might as well start doing that homework now. You're going to be thanking yourself down the road exponentially for doing that now.
So one of the things that I see trucks do at the end of a year, they try to analyze, like, where did I do well? Where didn't I do well? And I always try to tell them, keep a log of where you're selling the most chicken or where you're selling this. But another thing I'm asking them to do is to evaluate their mistakes. And in order to evaluate the mistakes, they need to know, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. So can you just talk a little bit more about protocols? Protocols and, the employees showing up, whether they punch in. What else should they be thinking about?
Yeah, that's, again, a great question. If you think about the manual, it's not just the recipes, it's not just the hours of operations, but how do you want your employees to be engaging with the customers? Little things like social media presence. Today websites like Yelp, online reviews are, they can really make or break a business. You really want to just get in front of all those things as much as you can, so that you're really kind of being more proactive as opposed to reactive. What you say as far as kind of analyzing the business, both the good and the bad, things that you've done well, mistakes that you've made, that's a really good point. I've got one of my clients as a franchisee, and they'll sit down and they'll look at the weather and it's 77 degrees. They'll be at a festival with one of their food trucks, and they know to, like, the second of the day that they're there, what is causing the customers to come and be happy or, on the other hand, dissatisfied. And again, they learn from those mistakes. And I'm a firm believer that mistakes aren't a bad thing. As long as you do learn from them, you can really make a lot of improvements that way.
Great. And another thing that I've been seeing nationally with the expansion of food trucks, and especially food truck rights through great association work, we're having superstars now. We've got superstars that have been on television. We've got superstars that are moving into brick and mortar. And so we have a lot of these food trucks that are now interested in franchising. I always like to tell them, get a lawyer, don't do this on your own. But one of the things that I've been hearing a lot about is this licensing word.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm just going to license it to this guy. He's going to take over New Jersey and it's going to be great. I always get nervous about that because I feel like licensing is not a real thing. Can you just kind of touch on what licensing versus franchising?
Yeah, so that's a phenomenal question. Licensing and franchising, a lot of people think that they're really similar and perhaps even kind of overlap. In some cases, they do. A traditional licensing agreement would be you're Walt Disney, you've got a new movie, the Minion movie, Despicable Me. I'm a shoemaker, and I want to create a shoe that features your brand or your character on my shoe, and sell that to elementary schools and kids all over the world. That's a true licensing. Franchising, on the other hand, is very clear, actually, if you think about the basic things that if these three things are present, you have a franchise. One is the use of your trademark, right? So the brand name. If your plan to expand involves expanding under a particular brand name, chances are you're probably going to want to franchise that, as opposed to if you just make a really good burger and you don't care what people are calling that burger in commerce, then you don't need to really trademark that. You don't have to be part of the franchising. Trademarking is the first element. The second thing is the payment of a fee, right? So franchising or licensing, on the other hand, most people, if they're giving licensing rights, they're not going to do it for free, right? They want an upfront payment, or they want an ongoing royalty fee. If one or both of those things are present, you've got a franchise. So the first is trademark. The two is the payment of some type of basically money changing hand. And the third thing, which I think probably goes the most unnoticed, is some element of control. If you're going to be my franchisee, and I've created this amazing food truck concept, well, kind of like what we were talking about, what are those procedures and protocols, right? How do I make sure that the consumer is experiencing that same great burger every time they come to Brandon's Burger Truck? Well, chances are you're going to have to do that with some type of element of control, those procedures, those protocols. If that third element is present, then you have a franchise. No matter what you and I call it, no matter what we put at the top of our agreement together, if those three things, trademark, some type of payment changing hands, and then the third thing is some element of control or a marketing kind of scheme, as they also call it, if those three things are present, you 100% have a franchise, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that.
So even if I call it a license, I say we write a contract out and we just call it a license.
People call it a license, they'll call it an affiliate agreement, they'll call it a joint venture, a partnership. I mean, I've heard dozens of different titles for it. And again, if you go back to those three main ingredients, pun intended, trademark, money change in hand, and the marketing element of control, it's a franchise no matter what.
And it's a franchise to the state in which they're doing business.
The franchise, actually, that's a really good question. Franchising law, there's twofold. One is the federal law, which applies, of course, in all 50 states. Those are where the three elements of franchising are rooted from. And then there are 17 states that have kind of additional, as I like to think of them, hoops to jump through in terms of franchising, which most of those 17 states actually require individual registrations with the state. So a lot of my clients, they want to be in all 50 states, and that's a pretty, each year we have to go through that registration and ultimately renewal process. But there are 33 states where, as long as you develop the disclosure document required for franchising, it's kind of a self-policing regulation that you've got to abide by.
Great. So you're a truck. You've decided you want a franchise now. And you've just decided, licensing is not for me, there's no such thing, I'm going to franchise. What's the next step? I mean, you're an attorney, you deal with this on a regular basis.
Yep.
I've heard of trucks just trying to do it on their own. Have you seen people do those types of things?
It's definitely possible. Franchising, a standard franchise disclosure document is anywhere from probably 150 to 200, 250 pages. Suffice it to say, it's a very large document, and I know people don't like to hear the word legalese, but at the end of the day, there are certain things included in that franchise disclosure document, FDD for short, that really are kind of legalese, really. And you have to have that document prepared. That, on the federal and the state level, no matter where you are in the United States, that document is required before you're able to really offer and ultimately sell that franchise. Lawyers are going to be able to get that done for you in a fraction of the time that you would be able to do it on your own. There are resources online that allow you to kind of do it yourself. I wouldn't recommend that. Just again, I mean, franchising, just like any other field of law, is really evolving every day, every month, every year. There's case laws that come up. A big one that kind of hit the franchising world within the last year was kind of that joint employer relationship, right? Is the franchisor the employer, or is the franchisee the employer? And up until about 2 years ago, there was really no question about that. But of course, things get challenged in the court system, again, wherever that may be, if it's in California or elsewhere. And those things kind of, evolve amongst themselves. And it's really important to kind of have a lawyer that you trust and that knows your business really well. Again, going back to that kind of foundation analogy, it's really important to have that lawyer in your corner so that you're not stressing out, geez, does that employer stuff apply to me? Is it a franchise? Is it a license? I guarantee you that those mistakes that will be extremely costly down the road are really, really, really easy to avoid, even by way of a kind of a quick consultation with an attorney that is experienced in franchising and or licensing that can kind of, if only, warn you of things to not do or to be cautious of.
Right. Well, I mean, that's, I'm a big proponent of that because I like people to make sure that they're prepared. So you made the decision, you're going to franchise, you get a good lawyer, you get your disclosure docs, and now you're going to get your first franchisee.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I've heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that first franchisee or all franchisees are like a marriage. Now, I didn't get a lot of background on that, but if you could agree with that or disagree with that, or
I say that almost on every single initial phone call that I have with a franchisor to be client of mine. It is much like a marriage. There's no doubt about that. And why? Primarily because it is a long-term relationship. Once you sign that franchise agreement, there are very few things that can create a divorce, if you will, between the franchisor and the franchisee, other than, of course, a mutual agreement to part ways. So you really want to make sure that your vetting process for awarding franchises, I always like to kind of think of it as truly awarding a franchise. You're not selling franchises, you're awarding a franchise. It's going to be your ambassador in that community, in that territory, wherever they may be. They're going to be the ones kind of doing the work and building that brand there. So it's really important that you're confident in their abilities, right? Do they have restaurant experience? Have they worked on a food truck before? Have they ever done anything in the food world? That's a really important thing that you'll kind of want to ask yourself. Number two, what your training program looks like is probably something that you should really iron out before even coming to a lawyer, because that's something that lawyers can't really, we can advise you on, but that's got to come from yourself, who's kind of developed this brand, right?
Years of experience,
and loads of experience, especially if you're not going to require your franchisees to have a great deal of experience. If you're confident in your abilities to train them and make sure that at the end of the week or 2 weeks, however long that training session is, that once they go home back to their territory, that you have complete faith and confidence in their abilities to basically do exactly what you've done over the past few years to get your brand where it is today.
Right. Yeah. The thing that I've been a little bit confused about is how do you, and we talked about this control. How do you control that they're actually doing what they say they're going to do? I'm looking at some of the people franchising right now, and they're all over the country, with food trucks.
Right.
And it's not like you can just walk into their store. You have to identify where they're going to be, kind of chase them down. Have you heard anything about that, or like protocols for the control mechanism?
Yeah, and my clients, those are issues that they come across pretty regularly. I will say that in today's digital era, it's surprisingly easy to be present somewhere that you're not. Whether that's with video cameras, having access. virtually every franchise relationship, certainly one that is in the food business, the point of sale system is where all the transactions come through, right? So having access, independent access to that point of sale system, the franchisor having access so that they can log in and they can say, okay, well, how's Matt's shop doing today? And within 30 seconds, you can have a pretty darn good snapshot of how the sales are going. Are the sales 25% of what they should be? Well, that's when it's time to probably reach out to your franchisee and say, hey, John, what's going on here? Out of all 10 franchisees, your numbers are substantially lower, and try and kind of address those things. But there's a lot of kind of safeguards that we can put into place to make sure that if there's a fire somewhere, so to speak, you're going to find out about it more sooner than later because of those safeguards being present. And again, going back to the Yelp reviews and that social media presence, chances are you're going to find out about it if it's something bad, of course, from a disgruntled customer. And those things are really hard to hide once they're put on the internet. So I think everybody is kind of aware of those things in today's era. But it's generally not a problem. The manual, what I was talking about, is that kind of the Bible of any franchise system. As detailed as that can be, you want it to be. And when your attorney's getting started on the disclosure document and putting that franchise agreement together, make sure that you're doing your homework and getting that operations manual in place, all the recipes, all the hiring stuff, employment practices, hours of operation, every little thing that you could imagine. What I tell my clients is, we'll know when that manual is completed, because every question that the franchisees could think to ask you, I want it to be right in there. It's going to save you some time on the franchisor side, so you're not answering the phone every 5 seconds. You can continue running your own trucks. But having that manual, which by the way is a living, breathing document, you're constantly updating that. Unlike the franchise agreement, which we signed today and we can't change that, the manual is something that the franchisor has complete discretion to update as often as it sees fit, really.
Well, one thing that I'm curious about, and I think this has come from a couple food trucks from a question standpoint, is now you've got let's say you have 10 franchises.
Yeah.
Now, what do you do to control the communication? Now, I mean, I've got trucks. Let's say I've got trucks in LA and New York. Do you give them their own website, their own email? Do they control their own media presence, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've got clients that kind of go about that both ways, right? Some are of the school of thought where, hey, Matt, we've trusted you to, take our franchise brand in your community. We'll let you kind of build the website that you'd like. I don't like that as much. Again, if you think about some of the best franchise systems out there, right? McDonald's, Subway, for the food companies. One of the things that both of those companies have is uniformity and consistency, really. We can go to a McDonald's in Budapest, and it's going to be pretty darn similar to the McDonald's down the street. And they haven't gotten that way by allowing their franchisees in these different communities and territories to kind of do things as they see fit. And frankly, I tell my clients who are primarily franchisors that it's their responsibility to kind of take those things off of the plate of the franchisee. In a perfect franchise relationship, I'm the franchisor, you're the franchisee, you're out there kind of executing that blueprint that I provided for you. You're not spending time thinking about, geez, what's the website supposed to look like? What promotions should be running on Facebook? You're supposed to be, selling those burgers, selling that food as much as you can, getting great spots, for the truck to be at different events, festivals, what have you. I mean, I really strongly encourage my clients to really take all that into their own, at their own discretion, because if you think about it, if I'm the franchisor, I've got the experience, right? I've been doing this presumably for 3+ years, if not longer. I know what promotions work well. I've kind of learned from all of those mistakes. Why let my franchisee go and relive through some of those mistakes? Yeah. So as far as kind of the website, things like that, I think having that controlled on the franchisor side is really the best way to go about it for those reasons and others. As far as communications, Internally, within the franchise system, I always help my clients kind of develop this, today online forum, right? Whether that's hosted on Facebook or some type of private software. It's really important that your franchisees, some of whom have been doing it for 3 years, others that have been maybe doing it for a few months, the more that they can communicate with one another, I think the better. That'll also save you time down the road as the franchisor, right? Let them help themselves. It's almost like in a classroom, right? If the kids are kind of free to help the other students, some kids are really good at math, right? I wasn't. I'd look upon those kids that were really good at math to say, hey, help me understand this. The same thing is true within the franchise system amongst franchisees. In terms of external communication, right? So if you're the franchisee and I'm a patron of the food truck, I think it's important for the franchisee to kind of at least begin leading those conversations, right? Developing those relationships with the patrons in the community. It just makes a lot more sense. Especially in the food truck business, I mean, if a customer comes to me as the franchisor, whether it's good news or bad news, I'm not really in the best position to fix it, right? If the burger didn't turn out well, come back next weekend and we'll get you one on the house, right? The franchisee is probably in the best position most of the time to kind of, again, initially host and kind of handle those conversations with customers. But I do think that that's something to really be cautious of, the internal communications amongst franchisees, but then also, kind of outward looking to the customers.
Great, yeah, that's a great answer. I think that's probably great advice.
Yeah.
So the thing that I'm curious about, I've seen franchises that have an incredibly easy to execute menu, where it can come in a bag or just kind of come all pre-prepared and ready to go. And then I've seen the ones that have a lot of prep work. Do you have any advice about the supply chain and like how food is distributed, and should it be picked up at a grocery store to the specifications of the franchisor, or if you can comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, supply chain again is, building that house from the start is one of those things you really want to evaluate. And that being said, supply chains also take time to kind of evolve and really mature. To discuss starting out, if you're just starting with the franchise system, again, I always, encourage my clients to look back at their first few years. They probably started buying food at the grocery store, maybe at Costco, and maybe ultimately some of the bigger suppliers, UNFI, Cisco. To the extent that you can, do all of that for your franchisees, the better, right? So there's going to be cost savings because you're kind of pooling it in together under one umbrella account. And also, like I said earlier, to the extent that you can give your franchisee a blueprint and say, hey, Matt, this is exactly what you need to do, A through Z, and your sole job is to do each of these things and to do them well. Mm-hmm. I don't want you worrying about going to find the best suppliers. Again, if you're doing that as the franchisee, I probably haven't done my job that well as the franchisor. And again, going back to the McDonald's or the Subway, that consistency and the uniformity, to the extent that you can point everybody to the same or similar group of suppliers. In today's world, it's pretty darn easy, at least here in the United States, to get something shipped from the East Coast to the West Coast. Challenge yourself to figure out, going back to building that foundation for the house, who is the best supplier for this? Where can I get the best prices? Because bringing the volume and kind of controlling that supply chain will result in really an increased bottom line at the end of the day, which will go to your franchisees and yourself as the franchisor collectively. You guys are you're either both succeeding or you're not succeeding. So in terms of supply chain, you really want to make sure that that's something that you control, and that you're doing your homework in advance before coming to the franchise lawyer saying, hey, I'm ready to start selling franchises. Make sure that supply chain is very dialed in. Wherever you are initially planning to have franchisees, which we can discuss. I think it's important to kind of start close to home and slowly build that out over time, just so you can kind of grow with that supply chain, which is something that will inevitably evolve over time as you grow the business.
Gotcha. Well, one of the things that we've talked about the contract being kind of static, and we talked about the forum being something that kind of lives and breathes, or the manual being something that lives and breathes. What about the disclosure document? The disclosure document, one of the things that I tell people interested in the franchise, well, first, after I say go talk to an attorney, is that they have a lot of responsibility, these people, and if those people fail, it sticks with them. Can you discuss the disclosure agreement and the responsibility of what you have to disclose on there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you trace back franchise laws to their inception, they're really investor protection laws, right? So, at the very core, a franchisee is an investor in a franchise concept.
Right.
And so decades ago in the 70s and the 80s, when franchising was really starting to kind of, catch on and mature, people were doing some pretty crooked things, right? And so the disclosure laws were put in place to really kind of help protect the prospective investor or prospective franchisee from some of those, crooked things that people used to do. The biggest disclosures that I always tell people that they need to be aware of, the first one that you said, in the back of an FDD, I don't know if you've ever recently looked at a franchise disclosure document, but there's two parts in the back. One is your existing franchisees, their full name, telephone number, address, today, email address. So you're going to be able to get to talk with them. And also, right on the next chapter are all of your former franchisees, and specifically who was terminated, right? So if they did something wrong, if they started selling fish tacos at my burger joint, I'm going to send them a warning. If they continue to do that, I'm going to have to terminate the franchise agreement. So, people that are no longer with the franchise system because they were terminated, there's a section for people that chose not to renew, right? So a standard franchise agreement is anywhere from 5 to 20 years, and then of course there are renewal terms thereafter. If you have franchisees that aren't coming back to sign the next franchise agreement, that is generally sometimes a red flag for prospective franchisees. And then other people, there's another section for franchisees that you've simply lost contact with in the last 10 weeks. So those are the three kind of negative disclosures, if you will, in terms of former franchisees.
Is there a section for people that just go out of business completely?
Well, there is, but that would be a termination. I mean, if people... It's a really good question as well. If people go out of business, it's either they abandon the franchise, which would be a cause for termination,
okay,
or they've, maybe it's a mutual agreement. Even if it's a mutual agreement, it's still an early termination.
So in everybody on there, there's a phone number and an email?
Phone number for existing and former franchisees. And that only goes back 3 years, but 3 years is a pretty darn long time. And so, that's kind of where we were talking about the marriage. It's kind of a funny analogy to draw between the franchisor and franchisee, but there are a lot of similarities. This being one of them is that, it is supposed to be a long-term relationship. And you really need to, when you make that commitment to be a franchisor, you've gotten your FDD, you've gotten your operations manual, everything is very dialed in. Probably more important than all those things is your vetting process for the prospective franchisee. And you really want to make sure that these people are going to be there for 10 years, if not longer, and that they do have the experience or the drive or the commitment to really be successful. Because if they're terminated, whether it's because they sold fish tacos instead of burgers, if it's because they gave up too soon, whatever the reason is, it really doesn't matter. They're no longer a part of the franchise system. And it may sound kind of harsh, but I do think that that's another responsibility of the franchisor, is to really make sure those things, you can't prevent them, right? People change, life happens to us. I mean, I've had clients where franchisees have, things have just happened in their life, and for a variety of reasons, it doesn't make sense to, go down the relationship any further, and that's going to happen. You're never going to be able to guard against that stuff, but it should be far and few between. You want the chapter that has existing franchisees to, be multiple pages, and the chapter of, former franchisees to be very, limited in scope. So those are kind of the biggest disclosures. The other thing that, the owners really should be aware of is that litigation and bankruptcy history from the owners or the managers, even the investors, that's a disclosure that's required for the last 10 years. So that's again, if you just trace the franchise laws back to being investor protection laws, which they are, if we are starting a franchise system together, and the last 3 businesses that you and I have been involved with together have all gone bankrupt, that's pretty material for a prospective franchisee to know, and there's a section for that. Similarly with litigation, if there's been a ton of administrative actions by the state of California or the Federal Trade Commission because of some of my shady business practices, that's also required to be disclosed as well. So that's something that you really want to kind of evaluate before you do make the decision to franchise, and that's where kind of having these preliminary conversations with a lawyer can be really valuable because look, some people, we all have kind of skeletons in the closet, and as long as we kind of plan for that and we're prepared for those things, they're very easy to kind of navigate around and make sure that we properly disclose those in the FDD and do so in a way that people aren't going to be running for the hills when they read your FDD.
Absolutely. So we've touched on this a little bit, but I see guys expanding. I've seen guys go all the way to New York for their first franchise from Los Angeles and have a really hard time kind of controlling how that goes. What do you think should be the plan of attack as far as opening up your first few franchises?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably one of the first things that you should be considering when and after you've decided to franchise is what that footprint looks like. What's the growth trajectory? Obviously, most franchisors, they want to sell 100 franchises in the first year, and that's a great thing if you have the resources and the infrastructure to do that. Most franchisors don't. And the one thing that I like to tell my new franchisors or franchisors to be is that there's really plenty of time to get to 100 franchisees, right? There's one really easy way to make sure that you never get to 100 franchisees, and that's by having your first 5 franchises be complete disasters. And if we're in Los Angeles, I really encourage my clients, especially if they have never been involved in franchising before, because it is a relatively steep learning curve. I mean, you are really good at the food truck business and perfecting those recipes. But franchising, as we've been discussing about, there's nuances. You're gonna kind of cut your teeth on the learning. What works well, what doesn't. Much as you've experienced over the past few years getting your food truck to where it is today, there's things, lessons that or mistakes that you wouldn't want to repeat. But you're glad that they happened nonetheless. I always tell my franchisor clients that try and kind of keep a pretty close footprint with during the first 3 years. And as a good rule of thumb, I say, you should be able to go on a plane and within an hour be at the food truck or at your franchisee's office, because things will happen. Life isn't perfect. People certainly are not, and you want to be able to drop everything and go there if it requires that. Really think of your first 5 to 10 franchisees as your firstborn, really. Yeah. And there's so many reasons for that. One is kind of, as I was saying, right, your best sales team 3 years from now are going to be your existing franchisees or your worst sales team, frankly. Prospective franchisees will look in the back of the FDD. They will call a handful of your franchisees. I tell my clients, just do whatever you have to do so that 2 years from now, when a prospective franchisee is calling you, I want the franchisee to not be able to shut up on the phone. I want them to just, Brandon's so great, Matt's so phenomenal, I would do it all over again. That's kind of the perfect case scenario for you in terms of your first franchisee. So really think carefully about, getting to New York from LA, it's a 5-hour flight, there's a 3-hour time change, you've lost an entire day, right? When an emergency happens, there is no getting on a flight and being there in 1 hour. And frankly, during those first year, 2, 3 years, you don't have that infrastructure in place. And it's really essential because those franchisees are going to be coming to you. I kind of say it's a marriage in some cases, and then other times I consider it to be a parent-child relationship. Because when you know what is hitting the fan, the child's going to be coming to the parent. What do I do? How do I fix this? And as the franchisor or the parent, you better be able to answer that question very quickly and have a solution. Because if you don't, they're going to have their own solution, which might not be the same as yours would be. It's just a lot of potential disasters that could come into play if you don't have kind of a close-knit franchise system to begin with.
Well, that kind of answers my second question, which is some people, and I've even heard of food trucks going international.
Yeah.
And so that sounds like it'd be something you'd want to do a little bit later.
Yeah, so with international expansion, first of all, different countries, much like the US, have different franchise laws, right? So Australia is notorious for maybe even being more strict than the US in terms of franchising. There's other countries like in Central and South America that don't have franchise laws. So it's really just any basic contract between two people entering into business together. So, speaking with a lawyer, my clients, when they say, hey, Brennan, we want to go to Costa Rica, we want to go to this great international market, I will always retain a local counsel there to kind of link them up because, I don't practice Australian law. The U.S. law is enough in and of itself, but there's really phenomenal franchise attorneys across the world that can help with that, and I think it's a really great thing. But I've had clients who've kind of gotten distracted by wanting to expand internationally, and in doing so, they've forgotten about their house at home, and the foundation, doesn't turn out well, and again, it turns out to be a distraction. So I would say at the soonest. If you are knocking the cover off the ball, you've got your first, 10, 20 franchisees over the, first 3 years. After you have that infrastructure and foundation and it's kind of running itself, you've got a team in place, that's when it's probably appropriate to kind of entertain those ideas of international expansion. And even then, what is most common is for the franchisor to basically enter into what's known as like a master franchise agreement or relationship, where in essence, someone like you would be the master franchisee and you would have the entire rights to Costa Rica. So effectively, you'd be stepping into my shoes as the franchisor in that country. Obviously, the franchisor still has say, really as much as they'd like or as little as they'd like in those relationships, but it can be a very easy distraction. It can also be a really phenomenal way to grow the brand, but it just really comes down to kind of evaluating what the opportunity is, assessing whether or not you have the resources to kind of go after that new market, and then the third thing would be making sure the supply chain is something that can be diverted and added in an international territory.
Great, and I think that the last thing I would like you to touch on. Again, I think people have a fear of lawyers. How much is it going to cost? What do I do? They know everything. I don't know anything. When you're approaching a lawyer, we hear about these things, retainer agreements. What should you be looking for in the lawyer for you?
Yeah.
What should you ask them when you're first making
first and foremost, who have you helped franchise before? Franchise law, I should say, is a very niche practice of law. Perhaps more so than any other, just because, the regulations, there's a lot of them. The federal level, there's 17 states that have their own franchise laws that are kind of nuanced. You really want to make sure that you're working with an attorney that doesn't just have business experience, that doesn't just have restaurant business experience, but a lawyer that truly does have franchise law experience. I've unfortunately worked with some of my clients that started working with the attorney early on that did not have franchise experience, looked at the laws, I can put together the FDD, and 2-3 years later, here we are spending all this time and money kind of unwinding what that attorney had done. So just make sure that they have experience with franchising, and whether it's on the franchisee side or the franchisor side, obviously I would suggest for you to make sure you find someone with experience helping franchisors. Just again, it's that side of the relationship that you're most concerned about and want to protect. After you kind of cross the box off in terms of experience, lawyers will, franchise lawyers kind of have a few ways that they go about it. Most traditional lawyers will bill kind of hourly on this. Getting a retainer agreement is a requirement actually for lawyers, so it should be something that happens anyways. But the retainer agreement is really it is your kind of foundational agreement with your attorney, right? It'll have everything in there. What does this include? What are you going to be able to help me with? What, more importantly, will you not be able to help me with? My retainer agreements with my franchisor clients, I don't like taxes. So I tell you right then in bold font, I'm not here to help you with taxation or real estate matters, things like that. I'm your franchise lawyer. That's what I'll help you with, and that's really the extent of what I'm able to help you with and do so well. But the retainer agreement will really have kind of, again, the A to Z of what that relationship is with your attorney. Again, what he or she will or will not do in helping you, whether it's an hourly arrangement. A lot of franchise attorneys these days are kind of moving over towards a flat fee, kind of after they have an idea of what that scope is. You know, do you want to first start in one state? Do you want to be in all 50 states to begin with? You know, kind of evaluating what the objectives are. And then most franchise attorneys really today are able to do the flat rate, which I think is best really for everybody. You know, obviously for the franchisors to be, it's nice because you know there's not this black hole.
Right.
I think a lot of the fear and discontent even with lawyers kind of stems from, you know,
black hole.
yeah, it is.
The
It is
black money
the
hole.
Milky Way, right? It is a black hole, or it can be, and you know, obviously with certain types of law, that is what it is, right? But with franchise law, because you know every FDD is the same in terms of the laws and the disclosures, right? There's 23 items: the bankruptcy, the litigation, everything that we just spoke about, and you know, so to some extent, you know, people become really, really good with the FDD, right? That's, you know, what I built my career around. So you just want to make sure that that's all kind of discussed. And, you know, I think pressuring for a flat fee arrangement, especially to kind of just get the franchise system, you know, developed with a document and those things, is really kind of easy to do. So, you know, try and push for that. I mean, in terms of other things with the attorney, the retainer agreement, making sure they have experience, and I think maybe more importantly than both of those things, make sure it's someone that you get along well with. I mean, my clients, I tell them that, you know, developing the FDD and the franchise agreement and helping with the operations manual, it really is the first inning of a very long inning game. And so I'd encourage you to really kind of vet those attorneys out, or the attorney, whichever it may be, that you're going to be working with, because you should be comfortable knowing that that's going to be your guy or gal for the, you know, foreseeable future when it comes to franchising. You know, I've worked with dozens of franchisors, and you know, like I said, we were talking about everybody makes mistakes. No one's perfect, but the value to you and the other franchisors to be are those mistakes that, you know, some of my other clients have learned from. You know, I'll always bring those to the attention of my new franchisor clients so that those mistakes can be avoided. And you'll have your own new mistakes to make that, you know, clients down the road will be able to learn from. But yeah, I think that's a really important thing, and that kind of goes back to, you know, finding an attorney that A, you're comfortable with, but B, has experience doing kind of what, you know, you're going to be embarking on over the next few years.
And as a guy that's dealt with a lot of attorneys over the years, not a lot of attorneys, but has used attorneys in a lot of matters, one of the most important things has been just having a good working relationship. Like, I like my attorneys.
Yeah.
You know, if I didn't like my attorneys, it'd be a nightmare.
Right, yeah.
So,
I always
so
say...
like your attorney, you know, sit down, talk to them, shake
Yeah.
their hand. If they're dismissive, think about it. So.
Yeah, no, I always say if you're afraid to pick up the phone and call your attorney, it's probably time to get a new one, because that's never a good sign.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. This
Yeah.
has been very helpful, and I'm sure people will definitely learn a lot from this.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Pat.
Yep.